I still dream about the silence. Not the kind of quiet you get planet-side, where there's always wind or insects, or the hum of machinery in the distance. The real silence, the absolute nothing that lives between the bulkheads of a dying ship, in the spaces where air has fled and sound cannot follow. They say you never forget your first boarding action, and that's the Emperor's own truth. But what they don't tell you during training is that you'll spend the rest of your life trying to forget it. 34 years I've served in the Imperial Navy, and I can still hear, or rather, feel the absence of hearing that terrible quiet pressing against my eardrums like ice water. I was 19 standard when I first walked a hostile deck, young enough to still believe the propaganda reels they showed us in basic, the ones where boarding parties swept through enemy vessels with righteous fury, lasguns blazing, heretics falling like wheat before the Emperor's scythe. Clean, heroic, quick. The recruitment officer who'd signed my contract on the agri-world where I was born had made it sound almost romantic. "See the galaxy," he'd said, his uniform crisp and his medals gleaming. "Serve the God Emperor among the stars." He hadn't mentioned that the galaxy looks very different when you're seeing it through a cracked visor while your best friend's blood freezes on your armor in, quote, crystalline patterns that catch the emergency lighting like rubies. My first posting was the Unrelenting Devotion, a lunar-class cruiser that had seen 3 centuries of service and bore the scars to prove it. Every surface was worn smooth by countless hands, every deck plate scratched and re-scratched by magnetic boots. The ship smelled like every void vessel smells recycled air tinged with oil, ozone from the plasma conduits, the peculiar metallic scent of too many bodies living too close together. Incense from the chapel drifted through the ventilation system at odd hours, mixing with the smell of the galleys and the latrines and the promethium refineries deep in the engineering decks. After a while, you stopped noticing it. After a while, you stopped noticing a lot of things. They assigned me to 2nd Boarding Company, 4th Platoon, which at full strength numbered 40 souls. Armsmen, they called us, though we were just ratings with heavier armor and better guns than the regular crew. Our sergeant was a man named Corvus, and the first thing I noticed about him was that he had no hands. Both arms ended at the wrists in smooth caps of augmetic steel, grafted directly to the bone. He could operate his weapons well enough, the neural interfaces saw to that, but he couldn't feel anything beyond the wrists, couldn't feel the cold of the void, or the heat of las fire, or the sticky warmth of blood. I asked him once, in the casual way young soldiers ask veterans about their scars, how he'd lost them. He looked at me for a long time before answering, and I remember thinking his eyes were wrong somehow. Too steady, too empty. "Boarding action," he said finally. 18 years ago, against an orc rock in the Canthus Gulf, lost them to frostbite when my suit integrity failed. He paused, and something that might have been a smile touched his lips. Was only a minute and a half. Lost both hands and 3 toes. Count yourself lucky if that's the worst that happens to you. Rating. Most men who lose suit integrity don't survive long enough to worry about frostbite. I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought frostbite was the worst that could happen if your void suit failed, that you just get cold and lose some extremities. The training sims had covered decompression in a clinical, abstract way. Pressure differential, ebullition, hypoxia, words on a screen, numbers in a manual. They showed us diagrams of human bodies in vacuum, cutaway illustrations with neat labels pointing to freezing saliva and expanding gases. They didn't show you what it really looked like. They didn't prepare you for the sound a man makes when every fluid in his body tries to become vapor at once. We were 3 months into our patrol route when the alarm bells started singing their dirge through the corridors. I was in the mess, choking down a ration bar that tasted like compressed cardboard and defeat, when the general quarters klaxon split the air. The sound of it still makes my jaw clench, that rising, falling wail that means someone, somewhere, is about to die. The Vox speakers crackled, and the master-at-arms voice rolled through the ship. Boarding parties to muster stations. This is not a drill. Repeat. Boarding parties to muster stations. Enemy contact in 45 minutes. The mess hall emptied like water down a drain. Men and women scattered to their stations, the practiced chaos of a warship preparing for violence. I ran with the rest of 4th Platoon toward our armory, my heart hammering against my ribs. Around me, veterans moved with grim efficiency, pulling on void suits, checking seals, loading weapons. The armory smelled like gun oil and fear sweat. Corvus stood at the center of it all, his augmetic hands moving with mechanical precision as he distributed ammunition and directed the organized pandemonium. "Listen up," he shouted over the noise, and the platoon fell silent. "Target is a Chaos Raider. Name unknown. Mass approximately 40,000 tons. She's damaged and trying to run, but our Nova cannon clipped her engines. Captain wants prisoners for interrogation, which means we're going in." He paused, and his empty eyes swept across us. "You've all trained for this. Remember your drills. Stay in pairs. Watch your suit integrity. Don't trust anything you see or hear on enemy decks. The warp does things to ships, things that'll make you wish you'd died in the void." Around me, men and women I'd lived and worked beside for months were transformed. They sealed themselves into armor, painted black and crimson, the colors of the Imperial Navy's boarding divisions. Carapace plates locked into place with heavy clicks. Void helmets, thick and ugly, and festooned with auspex sensors, descended over heads. I struggled into my own suit with clumsy hands, fingers made stupid by adrenaline. The interior smelled like rubber and my own stale breath. My rifle, a standard pattern lasgun, but reinforced for void operations, felt too heavy and too light at the same time. Beside me, a woman named Delia was checking her equipment with practiced hands. She'd been on 3 boarding actions before, which made her practically a veteran. "First time?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "That obvious? You're breathing too fast. Your visor's already fogging." She tapped her own faceplate. "Long, slow breaths. Save your oxygen. Could be hours before we're back on ship." She paused in her equipment check and met my eyes through our respective visors. "Stick close to me. Do exactly what I do. When I say move, you move. When I say freeze, you become a statue. Understand?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. My mouth was dry as ash. I'd spent months training in the simulators, practicing room clearances and corridor fighting, learning the theoretical application of violence in zero gravity. But standing there in the armory, listening to the ship's weapons begin their terrible chorus, I realized I knew absolutely nothing. The simulators couldn't replicate the smell of your own fear, or the way your stomach dropped when you realized you were about to be shot out of a perfectly functional ship toward one that might kill you in a dozen different ways. The muster deck was a cathedral of organized chaos. Hundreds of armsmen from different companies were assembling in their designated sections, forming up in tight ranks around boarding torpedoes. The torpedoes themselves were brutal things, just armored shells with primitive thrusters and a melter drill at the nose, designed to punch through enemy hulls and disgorge their human cargo into whatever hell waited on the other side. Each one could carry 20 men in conditions that would shame a livestock transport. We would be packed in shoulder to shoulder, mag-locked to the deck, praying to the Emperor that the torpedo's auspex could find a section of enemy hull that wouldn't immediately kill us when we breached. 4th Platoon was assigned to Torpedo 7. I watched my companions lock themselves into the embarkation frames, their movements steady despite the fear I could see in their eyes. Veterans and fresh meat alike, we all understood what we were about to do. Corvus moved through the platoon one last time, checking seals and connections, his augmetic hands gentle despite their mechanical nature. "Emperor protects," he said to each of us in turn, and we echoed the words back to him like a catechism. When he reached me, he paused. "Stay alive. Rating. First action's always the worst. If you can survive today, you can survive anything." His empty eyes held mine for a moment, and if you see anything in the red sections, anything that moves in ways that don't make sense, don't try to understand it. Just kill it and move on. Hesitation gets you killed. Curiosity gets your soul damned. I wanted to ask what he meant by red sections, but he'd already moved on to the next soldier. Around us, the ship shuddered as the main batteries fired, the vibration traveling through the deck and up through our mag-locked boots. The enemy was close enough now that I could feel each impact, each exchange of fire between our vessel and theirs. Somewhere far above, in the command cathedral that I'd never seen and never would, the captain and his officers were orchestrating this dance of mutual destruction with the cold precision of chess masters. The loading ramp of Torpedo 7 yawned open like a throat. We filed inside in order of our tactical positions, breaching team first, then riflemen, then heavy weapons, then support. I was positioned in the middle, a rifleman with no special role except to kill whatever presented itself as a target. The interior of the torpedo was exactly as uncomfortable as I'd feared. Bare metal walls. No padding. No amenities. Just anchor points for our maglocks and a single row of emergency lights that cast everything in sickly yellow. The air already tasted stale and my suit's recyclers hadn't even kicked in yet. They packed us in until there was no space left. Bodies pressed against bodies in a parody of intimacy. I could hear breathing through the vox harsh and rapid from some, slow and controlled from the veterans. Someone was praying, a whispered litany to the Emperor that the vox picked up and transmitted to all of us. Others joined in, their voices creating a strange harmony in the confined space. I found myself praying too, though I couldn't remember the words later. Just a formless plea to whatever might be listening in the cold dark between the stars. The ramp sealed with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Emergency lights shifted from yellow to red. Through the torpedo's thin hull, I could hear the mechanical clank and groan of the launch rails engaging, magnetic locks sliding into place. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear off my armor and sprint back through the ship to somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't this metal coffin hurtling toward a hostile vessel crewed by the Emperor knew what. "Stand by for launch," Corvus said over the vox, his voice preternaturally calm. 40 seconds to breach. Remember your training. Emperor protects. Emperor protects, we echoed. And I heard my own voice among them, thin and frightened, and trying so hard to sound brave. The launch was worse than anything the simulators had prepared me for. One moment we were locked in place. The next, the world became violence. The torpedo's thrusters fired, and I was slammed back against my maglocks hard enough to see stars behind my eyes. My stomach lurched. My inner ear screamed that I was falling, spinning, dying. The torpedo shook like a dying animal. I could hear the thrusters roaring not through the void. Sound can't travel in vacuum, but through the torpedo's superstructure itself, the metal screaming its protest at the forces being applied to it. Through the hull, I heard impacts, not close enough to penetrate, but close enough to make the whole torpedo ring like a bell. Point defense systems from the enemy vessel, trying to swat us out of the void like insects. I thought about what would happen if they succeeded. We'd just tumble away into the dark, our thrusters too weak to correct course, air running out while we drifted between the two warships engaged in their own lethal embrace. Or we'd tumble into the enemy ship's drive plume and flash cook in our armor. Or we'd hit at the wrong angle and pancake against their hull. Or, "Brace for impact," Corvus shouted, and I barely had time to lock my knees before we hit. The sound was beyond description. The melter drill at the torpedo's nose chewed through the enemy hull in a spray of superheated metal, and then we were decelerating so hard that my vision grayed at the edges. My teeth snapped together. I tasted blood. The maglocks groaned under the strain. Someone screamed. The universe was nothing but noise and violence, and the certainty that I was about to die. And then, suddenly, we were through. The torpedo lurched to a halt, embedded in the enemy hull like a parasite. The drill had done its work. Somewhere ahead, beyond the breaching team, there was a hole into the enemy vessel, and on the other side of that hole was everything I'd been trained to kill. Disembark, disembark, move, move, move. Corvus was shouting, and the torpedo's assault ramp was dropping, and then we were pouring out into the enemy ship, and everything I thought I knew about war turned out to be a comfortable lie we tell children so they can sleep at night. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Even through my suit's filters, I could detect it, the stench of decay and corruption, of things that had died and been left to rot in recycled air. The second thing was the temperature readout on my visor display, which informed me that the compartment we'd breached into was 17 degrees below freezing. The third thing was the darkness. Our helmet lamps cut through the gloom like knives, but beyond their reach was an absolute black that seemed to swallow light and hope in equal measure. We were in what had once been a cargo bay. Massive, empty. Frost covered every surface in delicate crystalline patterns. Our boots crunched on it as we spread out, weapons raised, sweeping for targets. The walls were covered in something that might have been rust or might have been dried blood. It was hard to tell in the uncertain light. Above us, exposed conduits dripped frozen moisture that shattered when it hit the deck. The void had gotten in here at some point, either from our breach or from earlier damage. Everything that could freeze had frozen. "Squads, form up," Corvus ordered, his voice crackling slightly over the vox. 2x2 formation, weapons free. Advance toward the primary objective. He paused, and I heard the click of him engaging a different vox channel, reporting back to the unrelenting devotion that we had successfully boarded. Around us, other teams were doing the same, our torpedo one of a dozen that had slammed into the enemy vessel like the fist of an angry god. Delia grabbed my shoulder and pulled me into position beside her. "Stay on my right," she said. "Watch the high angles. Heretics like to hide in the superstructure." She moved forward, her rifle tracking smoothly across potential firing positions, and I followed, because there was nothing else to do. We advanced through the cargo bay toward a blast door that hung half open, its mechanisms frozen in place. Beyond it was a corridor, and down that corridor was the ship's interior. And somewhere in that labyrinth of metal and madness were the people we'd been sent to kill or capture. The thought made my hands shake. I'd trained for this. I'd practiced in the Sims until I could clear a room in my sleep. But standing there in that frozen cargo bay, looking at that dark corridor, I understood with terrible clarity that simulation was nothing like reality. The corridor beyond the blast door was a nightmare of industrial decay. Conduits had burst, spilling frozen coolant across the deck in jagged ice sheets. The walls were scored with las burns and bullet impacts, evidence of earlier fighting. Emergency lighting flickered in irregular patterns, casting everything in a strobing red glow that made it hard to judge distances. We moved forward in our 2x2 formation, each pair covering the other, weapons tracking every shadow. Something moved in the darkness ahead. My finger tightened on the trigger before I could think about it, but Delia's hand snapped out and pushed my barrel down. "Hold," she hissed. A moment later, I saw what she'd seen one of our own boarding parties emerging from a side passage, their armor painted with the same colors as ours. They gave us a hand signal, indicating clear passage, and we returned it, two groups of armsmen, acknowledging each other, before continuing our separate hunts. We pushed deeper into the ship, following the route that had been programmed into our helmet displays before launch. The objective was simple: fight our way to the engine compartments and secure them for our tech priests to disable. Once the enemy couldn't run, the unrelenting devotion could take her time reducing the vessel to compliance or, if necessary, to scrap. But the path to the engines led through the ship's inhabited sections, through crew quarters and control stations, and all the spaces where desperate heretics might be waiting to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The first body we found was frozen solid, ice crystals forming delicate patterns across features locked in a final scream. Void exposure. My suit's medical scanner informed me helpfully. Cause of death: catastrophic decompression followed by rapid freezing. Time of death: approximately 6 hours prior. I stepped over it and tried not to think about the fact that this had been a person once, with thoughts and fears and maybe even people who'd cared about them. Tried not to think about how I might look exactly the same in an hour if my suit integrity failed. We cleared room after room, corridor after corridor, finding more bodies but no living enemies. The ship seemed abandoned, a ghost vessel drifting through the void, but our Auspex readings told a different story. There were still power signatures deeper in, still life signs clustered around the engineering sections. They were waiting for us, letting us advance into the ship's depths before springing whatever trap they'd prepared. 4th Platoon, this is Corvus. Our sergeant's voice crackled through the Vox. We're approaching Junction 17. Multiple heat signatures detected. Prepare for contact. A pause, and then, quieter. And remember, if you encounter red sections, report immediately and fall back. Do not, under any circumstances, proceed into red-marked compartments without explicit authorization from company command. There it was again. Red sections. I still didn't know what he meant, but something in his tone made my skin crawl beneath my armor. Delia must have sensed my confusion because she said, quietly, chaos corruption. Some compartments on heretic ships are so saturated with warp energy that reality gets thin. You'll know them when you see them. Everything's the wrong color, wrong shape. Things move that shouldn't move. You start hearing voices that aren't on the Vox. She paused, and I heard her breathing quicken slightly. My second boarding action, we lost 6 men in a red section. They just changed. Started screaming about revelations and cosmic truths. We had to kill them ourselves. Before I could respond, the world exploded into violence. The ambush came from everywhere at once, from above, from the sides, from compartments we'd marked as clear. Last fire stitched through the darkness, and someone in our squad went down screaming, their suit's integrity alarm shrilling a death song as vacuum found the breach and began its terrible work. I fired without aiming, without thinking, my lasgun pumping shots down the corridor in controlled bursts, just like they'd taught me in basic. Beside me, Delia was cursing steadily, a stream of profanity that was almost soothing in its normalcy as she methodically returned fire. The enemy were barely visible, just shapes in the darkness, human forms twisted by malnutrition and fanatical devotion. They wore no armor, just rags and rotting void suits, but they fought with the desperate fury of cornered animals. A woman emerged from a side passage, screaming prayers to gods whose names I couldn't understand, a crude autogun in her hands. Delia put 3 last bolts through her center mass, and she went down without a sound, her prayers cut short mid-syllable. The firefight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. When the last enemy fell, and the corridor went silent except for our harsh breathing and the screaming of the wounded, I looked down and realized I was standing in a spreading pool of freezing blood. It was already beginning to crystallize around my boots, turning from liquid to solid in the sub-zero temperature. Someone was crying over the Vox. Someone else was praying. Corvus was calling for casualties and ammo counts, his voice as calm as if he was conducting routine inventory. "We've got wounded," someone reported. Marek took a round through his primary oxygen tank. Suit integrity at 30%, and falling. He needs evac now, or he's going to freeze. I looked over and saw them 2 armsmen crouched over a third whose suit was venting precious oxygen in a visible plume. Even through the chaos and fear, I could see the cold mathematics of void combat playing out. Marek's suit was compromised. In this temperature, with his oxygen escaping, he had maybe 10 minutes before hypoxia took him, maybe 15 before he froze. But the nearest extract point was a 20-minute march back the way we'd come, and we hadn't secured the route yet. Enemy forces could collapse behind us, cutting us off, leaving us all to die in this frozen labyrinth. Corvus made the decision without hesitation. Seal his suit breeches with emergency foam. Give him a spare oxygen canister. He continues with us. The words were a death sentence delivered in a matter-of-fact tone. Marek would march with us until his oxygen ran out, and then he'd die, and we'd leave his body behind, because that's what you did in a boarding action. You moved forward, or you died. There was no room for evacuation, no space for mercy. I watched them spray the emergency sealant foam into Marek's suit breeches, the white substance hardening instantly in the cold. It would hold for a little while, maybe long enough to matter. Probably not. Marek himself seemed strangely calm about it all, his voice steady over the vox as he checked his weapons and reported ready to continue, like he'd already accepted his death and was just going through the motions until it claimed him. We pushed forward, leaving our dead and our dying behind, because that's what soldiers do. The ship's interior grew stranger as we advanced. The walls were no longer the plain metal of Imperial construction, but were covered in symbols that hurt to look at, 8-pointed stars and leering faces and twisted geometries that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The temperature fluctuated wildly. One corridor would be freezing, the next uncomfortably warm, the next back to frozen again. Reality itself seemed uncertain here, as if the laws that governed normal space had become suggestions rather than rules. And then we turned a corner and found ourselves looking at a section of corridor that was simply red, not painted red, not lit with red light, just fundamentally, impossibly red in a way that had nothing to do with color and everything to do with wrongness. The walls pulsed like living tissue. The air, which shouldn't have been visible at all, swirled in patterns that suggested vast, inhuman intelligence. And from somewhere beyond, I heard singing, not over the vox, not through the air, just a sound that existed directly in my head, wordless and terrible and somehow familiar. "Red section," Delia whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Back away slowly. Don't look at it directly. Don't." But one of our squad members, a young man named Trace, who joined the same day I had, was already walking toward it. Not running, not charging, just walking with the slow, dreamlike movements of someone in a trance. His rifle hung forgotten in his hands. His helmet was tilted upward, as if he was staring at something none of the rest of us could see. "Trace," Corvus shouted. "Halt, that's an order." But Trace didn't halt. He just kept walking, step by measured step, toward that pulsing red corridor. And as he crossed the threshold, I saw him change. Not his body. His body stayed perfectly normal, perfectly human. But something in the way he moved, in the way he held himself, became fundamentally other, like something vast and ancient had reached out across impossible distances and touched him, and in that touch had rewritten everything that made him human. He turned to look back at us, and through his visor I could see his eyes. They were crying blood, but he was smiling. The smile was the worst part. It was a smile of pure joy, of revelation, of someone who'd seen behind the curtain of reality and found it beautiful. "I understand now," he said, his voice crackling over the vox with a strange harmonic resonance, like multiple voices speaking in unison. "I can see what we're fighting for, what we've always been fighting for. The Imperium is a lie, but that's not the tragedy. The tragedy is that the lie is more beautiful than the truth, and we can't bear to." Corvus shot him. One perfect bolt through the visor, through the skull, through whatever Trace had become. The body collapsed, and a moment later it began to dissolve. Flesh running like wax, armor corroding to rust, until there was nothing left but a stain on the deck, and the echo of that terrible smile burned into my memory. "Seal this section," Corvus ordered, his voice shaking slightly the first time I'd heard anything but calm certainty from him. "Mark it on the tactical net as a red zone, corruption level extreme. We take another route to the objective." We backed away from that pulsing corridor, weapons trained on it, as if we could shoot the wrongness itself. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my rifle. Beside me, I heard Delia vomiting inside her helmet, the sound wet and horrible over the vox. Someone was praying again, the same litany to the Emperor, but this time it sounded less like faith and more like a desperate attempt to drown out the memory of Trace's smile. We found another route, a maintenance passage that led through the ship's ventral sections. It was cramped and dark and smelled like decay, but it was blessedly normal. Just metal and darkness and the familiar discomfort of soldiers moving through hostile territory. No red sections, no singing in my head, just the clean, simple horror of war. The fighting began again as we approached the engineering decks. The enemy had fortified the access points, turning corridors into kill zones with improvised barricades and overlapping fields of fire. We advanced through a storm of bullets and las bolts, losing soldiers with each meter gained. The Vox was chaos, screams and orders and damage reports all bleeding together into a wall of sound that made thinking nearly impossible. I killed my first person in those corridors. A man, though it was hard to tell under all the filth and makeshift armor. He came at us from a side passage, screaming something about false emperors and cosmic truth, and I put 3 shots through his chest before conscious thought caught up with reflex. He went down hard, his body hitting the deck with a wet thud. I expected to feel something horror, guilt, triumph, anything, but there was nothing. Just a weird numbness, as if some essential part of my humanity had been quietly excised without me noticing. We fought our way deeper into the engineering sections, clearing compartments filled with corrupted crew who fought with the desperate courage of people who knew they were already dead. The ship's interior here was a mad confusion of pipes and conduits and massive machinery that thrummed with power. The air was thick with the smell of promethium and ozone. Heat washed over us in waves from the plasma reactors, a welcome change from the frozen corridors we'd been fighting through. And then we found them, the engine compartments, exactly where our mission briefing said they'd be. Vast cathedral spaces filled with thrusters and plasma cores, and all the arcane machinery that pushed a Voidship through the stars. They were still running, still burning, keeping the vessel alive despite everything we'd done to kill it. Teams of enemy tech priests and their servitors moved among the machinery, performing rituals of maintenance and repair, trying to keep their dying ship breathing just a little longer. The battle for the engine rooms was the bloodiest fighting I'd ever seen. The enemy knew this was their last stand, that if we took these compartments their ship was dead, and they with it. They fought like rabid animals, sacrificing themselves in suicidal charges just to take one of us with them. We answered with disciplined fire, with grenades and flamers, with all the brutal efficiency of Imperial training. The engine rooms became a slaughterhouse, the deck slick with blood and other fluids, the air thick with smoke, and the smell of burning flesh. I was in the middle of it all, firing and reloading and firing again in a mechanical rhythm that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with muscle memory drilled into me through thousands of hours of training. A servitor lunged at me, its augmetic arms ending in industrial cutting tools, and I burned through its optics with las fire until it collapsed in a heap of twitching metal and meat. A tech priest in corrupted robes tried to seal a blast door against us, and Delia kicked it open and shot him 3 times before he could complete whatever prayer he'd been muttering. And through it all, Marek kept fighting. His oxygen had run out 10 minutes earlier, but somehow he was still moving, still shooting, his movements becoming slower and more labored as hypoxia claimed him. I watched him stagger, recover, fire twice more, then collapse against a plasma conduit. His suit's medical alerts were screaming, but he just kept raising his rifle, kept trying to aim, even as his body shut down around him. He died like that, propped against warm metal, his rifle still shouldered, frozen in the act of defending the Emperor's domains, even as his brain starved for oxygen. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the last enemy fell and the engine rooms were ours. We stood among the bodies and the blood and the dying machinery, our armor scored and cracked, our ammunition nearly exhausted, and waited for the tech priests from the unrelenting devotion to arrive and shut everything down. That's when I heard it again, the singing. Not over the Vox this time, but through the bulkheads themselves, as if the ship was crying out in a voice made of metal and madness. The walls around us began to take on that familiar red tinge, that awful wrongness that suggested the boundary between reality and something else was growing thin. "We need to evac," Corvus said, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Now. The entire engineering section is going critical. The warp is bleeding through." But even as he spoke, I could see it was too late. The red was spreading faster than we could run, flowing through the corridors like liquid light, transforming everything it touched. The bodies of the enemy dead began to move, not with life, but with something else. Something that wore death like a costume and laughed at the very concept of mortality. The retreat was a nightmare of running through corridors that changed as we moved through them, fighting enemies that shouldn't have been able to stand but kept coming anyway, their bodies held together by forces that had nothing to do with biology. We lost people not to enemy fire, but to the red sections themselves. I watched soldiers simply step into those pulsing corridors and vanish, or emerge changed, their humanity stripped away and replaced with something that required us to kill them on sight. By the time we made it back to our boarding torpedo, 4th Platoon had been reduced from 40 souls to 17. The torpedo itself was still functional. Miracle of miracles. Though the enemy hull around it had taken on that disturbing red tinge, we piled inside, desperate to escape, and launched back toward the unrelenting devotion while behind us the enemy vessel began to tear itself apart as the warp flooded through its superstructure. The journey back to our ship was silent, except for ragged breathing and the quiet sobbing of soldiers pushed beyond their breaking point. Through the torpedo's single viewport, I watched the enemy vessel die. It didn't explode dramatically like in the propaganda reels. It just came apart slowly, sections separating and drifting away, fires guttering out in the void, the whole massive structure collapsing in on itself like a dying star. And for just a moment, before the wreckage field obscured my view, I could have sworn I saw faces in the debris, vast, impossible faces, laughing at our victory. We were processed through decontamination when we docked with the unrelenting devotion. They stripped our armor, inspected every centimeter of our flesh for corruption, made us recite prayers, and submit to examination by the ship's sanctioned psychers. 3 more soldiers from 4th Platoon were dragged away screaming during the examination, their minds too damaged by exposure to the red sections to ever recover. That brought our survivors down to 14 out of 40. They gave us 3 days to recover, sleeping in shifts while the ship's medicae treated our wounds and the chaplains attempted to treat our souls. I spent most of that time staring at the ceiling of my bunk, unable to close my eyes without seeing Trace's smile or hearing that terrible singing. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of red corridors and voices that promised understanding if I'd just walk a little farther into the dark. On the 4th day, the alarms sang again. Another boarding action, a different enemy vessel. I suited up with hands that had learned to stop shaking and followed Corvus and what remained of 4th Platoon back to the torpedoes, back to the violence and the fear and the red sections that waited in the depths of corrupted ships. That was 34 years ago, and I'm still here, still fighting, still boarding hostile vessels and killing the Emperor's enemies in corridors that smell like death and corruption. 4th Platoon has been rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt again a dozen times over. Corvus died 6 years into my service, killed when his suit failed during a boarding action against an Orc hulk. They gave me his position, made me a sergeant, grafted augmetics to my hands when I lost them to frostbite during a mission in the Perdition Gulf. The cycle continues. But here's what they don't tell you in the recruitment reels, what the propaganda leaves out. Every time you board an enemy vessel, you leave a piece of yourself behind. Not metaphorically, literally. Something in those corridors, in those red sections, in the spaces where reality grows thin, it takes a part of you, your humanity, your sanity, your soul. Call it what you want. By the time you've survived a dozen boarding actions, you're not entirely human anymore. You're something else, something that can look at horror and feel nothing, something that can kill without hesitation and sleep without nightmares. I train new recruits now, young soldiers who remind me of what I used to be. I see the fear in their eyes when I tell them about their first boarding action, and I remember having those same fears once. I want to tell them it gets easier, that you learn to cope, that the human mind is remarkably resilient. But that would be a lie. It doesn't get easier. You just become less human. And being less human makes it seem easier because you've lost the parts of yourself that could feel horror and revulsion and basic human empathy. Sometimes, late in the ship's night cycle when the corridors are quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder if that's the real victory of chaos. Not corruption, not mutation, not grand dramatic transformation, just this slow, inevitable grinding down of everything that makes us human until we're barely different from the servitors we command. We fight the enemies of mankind, but the cost of that fight is our own humanity. We win every battle and lose ourselves in the process. I've seen things in those boarding actions that would drive most people mad. I've walked through red sections where the walls breathed and whispered secrets that gods shouldn't know. I've killed friends who were corrupted, shot children who'd been twisted into weapons, burned entire compartments full of desperate people because orders are orders and hesitation gets you killed. And I've learned to live with all of it, to carry those memories like familiar scars, because that's what it means to serve. The worst part isn't the violence. It isn't even the corruption or the horror or the constant proximity to death. The worst part is realizing that I'm good at this, that I've become exactly what the Imperial Navy needs a soldier, without hesitation, without mercy, without the inconvenient burden of excessive humanity. I can board a hostile vessel and clear it deck by deck with cold efficiency. I can make the hard calls that get soldiers killed, but complete the mission. I can look at young recruits and send them to their deaths, knowing exactly what I'm doing and why it's necessary. Is that corruption? Or is it just what happens when you do this job long enough? When you've seen behind the curtain of reality and glimpsed the vast, uncaring forces that move in the spaces between stars? I don't know anymore. I'm not sure the distinction matters. There's a new batch of recruits arriving next week. I'll train them, teach them the skills they need to survive their first boarding action. Some of them will listen and live. Some won't and will die. The ones who survive will eventually replace me, taking on the burden of training the next generation, while I'm promoted to some administrative position where I can quietly drink myself to death or eat my service pistol, or simply fade away into the vast machinery of the Imperial Navy. But before that happens, there will be more boarding actions, more torpedoes launched into hostile vessels, more corridors filled with violence and corruption, and red sections that promise terrible understanding, more pieces of my soul left behind in those killing grounds between the stars. The cycle continues, because it must, because the Imperium requires soldiers willing to descend into hell and drag its enemies back to face the Emperor's judgment. I still dream about the silence sometimes, that absolute nothing that exists in the spaces where air has fled. But increasingly, I dream about the singing too, that wordless hymn that echoes through corrupted ships, promising revelation to anyone brave or foolish enough to listen. It's getting harder to distinguish between the two, the silence and the singing, the void and the warp, the human and the post-human. Maybe that's the real horror of void combat. Not that it kills you, though it does that with depressing regularity. Not that it corrupts you, though that's always a risk, but that it changes you so slowly and so completely that by the time you realize what's happened, you're already something else. Something that serves the Emperor with perfect efficiency because you've lost the capacity to question or doubt or feel anything beyond the immediate tactical requirements of the moment. They call us heroes, us veterans of 100 boarding actions. They pin medals on our chests and promote us and tell stories about our victories. But I know what we really are. We're the ghosts of people who died the moment they first walked a hostile deck, still moving and fighting because that's all we know how to do. Still serving because the alternative, acknowledging what we've become, would be more horrifying than any red section, any warp corruption, any enemy we've ever faced. The Emperor protects, they say. And maybe he does, in his own way. But he doesn't protect you from yourself, from what you become in his service. That transformation, slow and inevitable and absolute, is the price of defending humanity from the darkness. And we pay it gladly, those of us who serve, because we're already too far gone to imagine any other life. The alarms will sound again soon. They always do. And when they do, I'll suit up and board another hostile vessel and fight through more corridors filled with blood and madness. I'll send more soldiers to their deaths and kill more enemies and leave more pieces of myself behind in those spaces between the stars. Because that's what I am now. That's all I am. A weapon pointed at the Emperor's enemies. As cold and cruel and efficient as any weapon needs to be. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between actions, I wonder if the real difference between us and them, between the loyal and the corrupted, is anything more than the color of our uniforms and the direction we're pointed. We're all walking corpses here in the void, human only in the loosest biological sense, kept moving by forces we don't fully understand and can't escape even if we wanted to. The silence is waiting for me. Has been waiting since that first boarding action 34 years ago. One day my suit will fail, or a bullet will find a gap in my armor, or I'll step into a red section one time too many and not come back out. And when that happens, when I finally join Corvus and Delia and Marek and all the others who've gone ahead into that final dark, maybe I'll find peace, or maybe I'll find something else, something worse. But until then, I serve, I train, I fight, I kill, I endure, because that's what we do, we veterans of the void. We carry our horror with practiced ease and march toward each new battle with the grim certainty that it will be exactly as terrible as the last one, and we'll survive it anyway, and that survival will cost us more of our humanity than we can afford to lose. The Emperor protects. They say it like a promise, like a comfort. But I know better now. The Emperor protects the Imperium. The Emperor protects humanity in the abstract. But individual humans, individual souls, ground down in his service until there's nothing left but meat and training, and the fading echo of someone who used to be capable of fear and hope and joy, those he doesn't protect at all. That's the horrifying reality they don't mention in the recruitment reels. Not the violence, or the death, or even the corruption, but this, that you can win every battle, survive every boarding action, serve with perfect loyalty and absolute dedication, and still lose everything that made you human in the process. That the real cost of defending mankind is measured not in lives lost, but in souls incrementally destroyed, ground down across years and decades until you're left with something that wears your face and carries your name but isn't you anymore, hasn't been you for a very long time. And the truly horrifying part? By the time you realize what's happened, you won't even care.